I recently did a video that was just a conversation and just some thoughts I had on my Fujifilm X-T4. And I kind of like that freeform type video. So I'm going to do one now on my X-H1. So that's what this is. Just a conversation and some thoughts I have on my Fujifilm X-H1. So if you've followed this channel for a while and watched a lot of my videos, you probably have heard some of this story throughout the past couple of years. But to recap a little bit of my journey with the Fujifilm system, I jumped into the system with the X-T100, actually, one of the non-X-Trans sensor cameras. At that time, I just wasn't educated enough on the lineup and saw the price of that and thought it looked tempting. I thought it would be nice to try something with the X mount, the X lens mount. So I bought that one, experimented a little bit. To be honest, I was underwhelmed with the camera to a certain extent, but one thing that I really did like was the lens that I got for it, because I had the kit lens, but then I bought the 35 f2. I really enjoyed the lens, and I knew I liked the I liked it enough to know I liked the Fujifilm system. I just wasn't really impressed with that camera. So I sold that camera, kept the 35 f2, and just waited a little bit. I didn't have any Fujifilm camera for a little bit. And then at some point, the X-T2 went on sale, didn't go on sale. There was a whole bunch of X-T2s that hit the used market. So I bought X-T2 on the used market. I already had my 35 f2. So the X-T2 with the 35 f2 became my Fujifilm camera for a while. Not quite a year, but close to it. And I fell in love with the entire Fujifilm system at that point. The X-T2 became my favorite street photography camera, and I really, really loved that camera. I started experimenting with video on it a little bit, but it was mainly just a really awesome stills camera that I enjoyed using. But then when the X-H1 went on sale for $9.99 for that complete package of the body, grip, 3 batteries, I knew I wanted to try the X-H1 enough, and I knew it was close enough to the X-T2 that I felt comfortable selling the X-T2 in order to put that money towards the X-H1, and that's what I did. So anyways, that's how I got my X-H1. Since I got the X-H1, I've had a whole bunch of other Fujifilm cameras come in and out of my possession, but this has stayed consistent. I've had this for over not quite 2.5 years, but well over 2 years now. And like I said, it's been my longest running Fujifilm camera. Fast forward to late last year or fall of last year, I got an X-T4. And since the X-H1 was my main video camera, all of a sudden the X-T4 became my main video camera. So that got me thinking, well, maybe I should sell the X-H1, use that money to get something smaller. For some reason, I'm always drawn to the idea of a small camera. So that's why I tried the X-T1, I tried the X-T2, X-T20, all those X-T1, all those kinds of cameras that were a little smaller. So I put this up on the used market. I was going to sell it, and then recently I started to take it out again and rotating between doing street photography with the X-H1 and doing street photography with the X-T4. And I realized that at least right now, you change your mind all the time. I change my mind a lot. Right now, I'm thinking that the benefits of me selling this to get something smaller, there's not going to be enough of a benefit for me to do that because of so much that I do love about this camera that I'm gonna miss when I don't have it. So I've decided to keep it and to make the most of it because it is a great camera and I do enjoy using it. Maybe someday I'll just save up enough money to get another small camera, but still keep this. I think I'll regret selling this, you know, more than I regret almost selling any other camera because it is unique at this point. As I was taking it out recently to do street photography and rotating it between my X-T4 and the X-H1, I started to be reminded of some of the little small things that all add up to what make it one of my favorite cameras. And, you know, it reminded me why I have it, why I bought it, why I still have it, and probably why I shouldn't sell it. So in this video, I want to talk about just some of those things, some of the stuff that you really can't find on a spec sheet, stuff that doesn't show up in the numbers and that probably people didn't talk a lot about when they did the earlier reviews. And there's not a ton of videos on the X-H1 that have been produced recently. I know I saw a couple recently, a couple videos recently, but there's not a ton. After a camera gets to a certain age, even if it's just a year old, there's hardly any YouTube videos about them. And I don't want to do gear related videos all the time, but I think even though this is a gear related video, this is also a video about just learning and using and making the most of whatever camera you do have. And for me, one of my cameras, I have two cameras, one of them is the X-H1. One of the initial attractive elements of the X-H1 for me was its DSLR style grip, because even though at that point I had an X-T2, well, actually when it was announced, I don't think I had any Fuji camera. So when it was announced, I was still using DSLRs exclusively. So a large grip was something I was already really comfortable with. So that attracted me from the very, very start when they first announced it. But fast forward a few years, I don't need a big grip like this. I've come to really love the slightly slimmer grips of the XT line of cameras. So that's less of a big deal to me. But I still think this is a really, really comfortable grip, easy to hold, and there is some advantages about having something substantial to hang on to when you're holding the camera. So the grip is, I think, a net positive, even though it does make the camera a little bigger. Like I've said before, that for some reason I'm always drawn to looking at these smaller cameras and wanting to get one and have one again. And my temptation to sell this one in order to get a small camera was for that reason. I'm always drawn to the small camera. I like the compact size, and the idea of being able to put it in a small compartment, to put it in your pocket, so to speak, was really enticing. But what I do remember about having a small camera from having the XE1, XE2, XT20 was that when I had those, and they were small, besides differences in image quality and whatnot with some of them, the other things I missed was the build quality difference. I missed the noticeable improvement on build quality of the X-H1 over most of the other Fujifilm bodies, minus maybe the X-T4, which is arguable. You can argue the difference in build quality between those two. I think they're pretty close. They're just different in the way that they're designed and made. But build quality was something I missed on those small cameras. They're built great, but when you compare those to this and the X-T4, you notice a difference. So I did miss that. The other thing I missed was I missed the ISO dial, and that's just a complete personal preference thing. Part of it almost it's not just vanity. I mean, they are extremely useful dials. I did miss having that instantly accessible without having to either go into the menu or having to set it to a dial. I missed having the ISO dial, and that's actually I think one of my biggest beefs with the XT20, XT30 is, yeah, I appreciate the program mode dial. But if the program mode dial on those cameras was an ISO dial instead, Those would almost be a no-brainer for me. Those are close enough otherwise. But the ISO dial was something I definitely missed. I missed having the option for 1/8,000th of a second shutter speed. It's one of those things where, yeah, I don't always use it, but the fact that you do have that one extra stop, sometimes having the extra stop on the shutter speed allows you to shoot a little more wide open, which is nice. Some practical benefits of the X-H1 that I really like is that it still has, unlike some of the smaller cameras that have to sacrifice one or the other, it still has the D-pad and the joystick, so you get the best of both worlds there. It also has a touchscreen. The touchscreen may not be quite as refined as the newer cameras, but it's still pretty good, and I use it all the time for focusing, for adjusting things in the menus and whatnot, or not in the menus, I should say, in the Q menu, but mostly for focus adjustments and whatnot. So it's very handy and useful. The other thing as far as buttons go is that the AF on button, which I use constantly, is nice and large and placed in a really good spot. And as far as street photography goes, it has the classic screen that many of us prefer for street photography, although I am making a video about the X-T4 flip out screen. I'll post that soon, but regardless, this screen is the screen that most of us have come to enjoy for street photography on the Fujifilm cameras. So it's got this angle, but it also has this angle that the X-T2 introduced, and the X-T3 and the X-T3 and X-H1 both have as well. And that's the angle that some of the other cameras don't have, like the X-T20, X-T30 and whatnot. And you would think like, that's not a big deal, and it's really not a big deal overall, but it is an angle that I've used enough that I know that I would miss that, and I did kind of miss that when I had the other cameras. One negative that some people mention, especially when it first came out, some people prefer the exposure compensation dial, the physical dial for exposure compensation, and the fact that this didn't have it was a negative to some people, which I can understand, and you know, I can relate to a certain extent because I feel the same way when there's no ISO dial. But the fact that you can use this wheel, this button and this wheel here, or a combination of them to adjust the exposure compensation, makes it just about as easy to turn. And the fact that you not only can use that to adjust exposure compensation, but the fact that you still have a reading right there telling you what it's set at. Even if the camera's off, it tells you what your last exposure compensation setting is at. So you still have the same information as you would if you had the physical dial. You can see where you're set at, and you can change it with that dial and that button. So it's not really that huge a deal. It doesn't really slow down the workflow too much. A lot of what I mentioned so far is the physical aspects of it and usability, because I think that's kind of one of the things you have to think about when you're talking about Fujifilm cameras, since you could compare this to the X-T2, the X Pro 2, X-T20, and so on, and say that an X-T3, and say that they all have the similar processor and sensor combination, so they all, in theory, produce very similar, if not identical, pictures. Then it does come down to these kind of things: the ergonomics, the buttons, the layout, the whole, all the attributes combined determine which camera is more of a perfect fit for you. And I think like I could have an X-T2 instead of an X-H1 and be, I think, just about as happy as I am with the X-H1. It's as far as street photography goes, it's probably a coin toss. This could be an X-T2 instead of an X-H1, and I'd probably be just as happy, or close to it at least. But there are a few things in here that the X-T2 doesn't have. We talked about some of them on the body itself. The larger AF on button, the difference in exposure compensation, but it also has a quieter shutter mechanism and a smoother shutter mechanism. The shutter button is just really smooth. It's hard to explain unless you've used it. People complained about how the responsiveness of it. I think maybe they may have silently tweaked the models of the X-H1, and I got a little bit of a later one, and mine is more refined. But some of the early X-H1s, people complained that you couldn't feel that halfway mark when to get focused and then click it all the way. I haven't had any issue with my shutter button. It's been nothing but awesome, and it's one of my favorite things about the camera is the whole shutter mechanism, from the shutter sound to the button itself. The touchscreen is something that this has that the X-T2 does not have, and that's something, again, something that I reminded myself that I'd be giving up if I went from this to an X-T2. The X-T30 and those kinds of cameras have a nice touchscreen, so those would be that would be maintained there. But a couple other things that this has that the X-T2 doesn't have. Obviously, this has the Eterna profile. I know this is kind of another rambling one like my X-T4 video, but this is kind of like thought process that I'm going through myself to remind myself that, you know, of the little things that I might miss choosing a different camera, whether I'm choosing a different camera based on size or based on some other aspect. Now, when I was looking at the Fujifilm X-T30 Mark II, it wasn't just on size. It was the fact that it had the same set of film simulations and settings as my X-T4. So as far as stills go, it was essentially a mini X-T4. I think they could have called the X-T30 Mark II an X-T40, and I wouldn't have thought anything different. I mean, I wouldn't have complained. I think that they could have named it that if they wanted to, because it's, you know, all the settings, all the built-in simulations that are on the X-T4 are on the X-T30 Mark II. So I did like that, and I still do like that idea of having a smaller version of X-T4. And someday I may get that, but I don't want to give up this camera in order to do that, I don't think. So that being said, besides the small form factor, it was the film simulations built in and the more refined settings that you could do for your recipes, like having 2 sets of grain settings. So you had the size of it, the small and large and all that stuff, and then you had weak and strong. You could do more refined grain settings for your JPEGs. I really love that. I had some of the color chrome effect. That stuff I really haven't used too much. Even clarity I haven't used too much on my X-T4, but it's more about the grain effect and the built-in simulations and just the way the sensor and processor produced images in the X-T4 that I was looking forward to trying on the X-T30. But like I said, going back and forth between these two cameras again and reminding myself that like there's a lot that you really love about this camera, and just don't forget that. And one of the things that I've reminded myself recently is that, like, you know, the black and whites from the X-T1, whether it's the JPEGs or whether it's me shooting black and white and then finishing the processing in Capture One, that they're really, really good at the X-H1. I think close enough to the X-T4 that I can't use that as a justification to sell it and get the X-T30. There's not that much of a difference between the black and whites of the X-T4 and X-T30 Mark II versus the X-H1. The black and whites from this are really, really, really solid. But realizing that took me kind of coming down from the new toy syndrome of me getting into the X-T4 and wanting another new camera. It took me just to calm down and compare and really analyze how I shoot, what I like to shoot, and analyzing the actual images in the computer and looking at them and saying, okay, well, what's the actual difference? You know, is it just my perception, or is there real, tangible differences? And as far as the black and whites go, there's some minor differences, but they're both really, really, really well, really, really good, and close enough that I can't sell this camera on that basis alone. Fujifilm claims that this the metal, the metal core, the metal body of this is thicker than the other cameras that came before it, and it's hard to know that unless you really have a way to compare it. But I can tell you the build quality of this is pretty top notch, and it feels like an extremely well made camera. And if there wasn't a digital screen on top, it would feel almost like a film camera to a certain extent, meaning that like you can tell it's made of metal. Obviously, you have the rubber grip and stuff around it. Other than that, the build quality is really, really solid, and the usability of it is really nice. Even though the dials and whatnot are made of metal, they're very, very easy to turn, and they're really a joy to use. I think right now I was seeing X-H1s on Used Photo Pro between $650 to $800, depending on the condition. I think KEH had them within a similar range. Maybe KEH had some that were a little more expensive than that, but they fall close enough to the XT2 that unless you don't like this larger grip, I think there's a benefit to get this over the XT2 for a lot of people. But that being said, if you don't need some of the video features and you don't need Eterna, you don't need IBIS, which I didn't really talk about yet, the X-T2 is a fantastic camera and might be one of the best buys currently if you can get it around $600. Yeah, of course this has IBIS. I didn't really talk about that. I do use it sometimes in with street photography stuff, but not all the time. And actually recently I haven't used it a ton. But every once in a while it's nice. It's nice to use. It's nice to take advantage of on those situations where it makes sense to. When this was released, people either were really, really focused on IBIS or the autofocus, and although both were solid, neither of them were top of the line, meaning that the IBIS wasn't better than Panasonic's and the autofocus wasn't better than Sony's, which at that time both of those brands were probably top of the line in those respective categories. So if it's not best, then then the reviews of the camera were kind of lukewarm. Some people still loved it, but some people just emphasized, well, the autofocus is good, but it's not as good as Sony. The IBIS is good, but it's not as good as Panasonic. That's the gist of a lot of reviews back in the day when this first came out. You still get a little bit of that now, but I think the reality is, if you enjoy this camera, it's not going to be because you need the top of the line aspects for autofocus and IBIS. There's a lot that go into finding the perfect camera for you. I think one of the ways to look at this is look at this like some people looked at getting the Nikon D700 years after it's been out, where you're getting a high quality, well-made photography photographic tool. At the time that this was released, though, this was the top of the line camera for the Fujifilm X series lineup, the crop sensor lineup. And so, although it didn't have the industry leading specs, they put a ton of care and passion into building this camera, and that shows in the design and the build quality and all these little things that add up to a fantastic camera. And all that stuff's still there. It's even further down on a best of list if you're talking about cameras with best IBIS, best autofocus, best whatever. It's not going to win in any of those categories. But it's like getting a high quality used car. It's still high quality 5-10 years from now. It's just not new. And that's what this is. I mean, I think you can spend the same amount of money on a brand new camera that has better autofocus and has other features that are better than this, but maybe that new camera doesn't have this build quality or doesn't have the same ergonomics or these other small things that add up when you add up everything and make it a really unique camera. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I forgot to talk about. I seem to be on a roll with these rambling videos lately, but they're, I've found that this is the best way for me to go about YouTube most of the time, is just talk to the camera, talk to you guys, and about the random thoughts I have about this stuff. It just fits me better. So sometimes I forget to say things and I'll think about it later and I'll make a new video. But my whole point with this is kind of sharing my journey with you and sharing some of my thought process as I go along. So, last month I talked about, well, should I sell this and get the XT4 or XT30 Mark II, or maybe even the XS10? And there's something in the back of my head that was started to say, well, I think, should you sell it or should you not? Are you going to miss stuff? So in order to really think through that, I decided to take it out a few more times with my new wrist strap and my new neck strap and my new camera bag, and do some new street photography with it. And every time I do that, there's never a time I'm out where I'm shooting with it where I think, oh, I wish I had something else. Like I'm just in the moment. I'm able to be in the moment and to create the shots that I want to create. And then when I come back to my computer and I'm in Capture One, I'm just really enjoying the shots I get. So nothing in that process is telling me you need a new camera or need a different camera for street. I've just figured out small tweaks and hacks for me to make the most of everything. One of those things was finding this neck strap, getting this camera bag, and things like that. But I think I need to start wrapping this up. It's been long enough. But my whole thing with this is that there's a lot that is in this camera that adds up to make it an amazing camera that you're not going to see on a spec sheet. And to a certain extent, obviously, it's even hard for me to kind of put into words because it's kind of hard to explain. But my thing to you is, if you see one on the used market and you're curious about it, it's a pretty low risk gamble, because I have a feeling that prices are going to land and stay there for quite a bit. Even if the X-H2 is announced, which we know it's going to be announced at some point this year, but even if it were announced tomorrow, I don't think the prices of the X-H1 are going to plummet at all. I think if anything, it's possible that the X-H2 doesn't have something or changes something that this did have, people are going to miss. Whether it's the X-H2 having a flip out screen and people are going to miss this old school screen, or something else. It's always possible that the new version switches or changes something that people miss about the old version. And that could just be the sensor and the image output, or it could be something else. But you never know. We'll see what happens. But this is a great camera, and I just needed to go through this whole process to remind myself of that, so I keep it and don't end up regretting selling it. So I guess that's finally it for this video. I appreciate every one of you guys. Feel free to leave me some comments and let me know if you have the X-H1 or if you have any more questions on the X-H1. Maybe I'll do more videos about it. I will have more recipes coming this year on the X-H1 and on the X-T4. So that's it for now. Thanks again, guys. I'll talk to you soon.